you went to Vietnam very, very early,
Yes.
long before most Americans were really even aware that a significant problem was brewing over there.
Right.
Um, when did you go into the military? Is it the Army that you went into?
Air Force.
Air Force, okay.
Yes.
When,
October of 61.
so you go into the Air Force in 1961. How old were you?
Oh, I was 20. I was 22.
22. And so why did you go into the Air Force at that time?
I was working in the copper mines in Arizona, and I was working 7 days off or 7 days on and 1 day off at 10 to 12 hours a day, going nowhere. My young wife had just become pregnant,
Mm,
and I thought, well, maybe, maybe I'll go in the military. I can learn a trade, learn a skill or something to help me with my future. And that was my first thoughts with it at the time, really was.
wow. At that time, had you even heard of Vietnam?
No,
Wow. Yeah.
didn't know existed.
Wow. 61. Yeah, it's very early. Um, what was your job in the Air Force? What were you trained to do?
In the military.
Yeah, in the Air
Yeah.
Force. Yeah.
I was trained as um, I can't remember what the exact calling was, but we were trained to operate radar, tear radar down, put it back up.
Okay. So basically radar maintenance is what you were trained to do?
Yeah, it was something along those lines. Yeah, I can't remember exact career field calling.
So what was it then that brought you what was it about that job then that got you to Vietnam? Why did, I mean, because very few people are going to Vietnam in 1961. It's a very small number. Why are you among that small number? What was special about your job that got you there?
Well, the understanding that I have of it was that they had sent us over there to teach the RVAT, the Army of Vietnam,
Right.
how to take this mobile radar and move it, because they were already uh, finding out that the North was moving troops and supplies and everything into the South, and they needed listening posts set up. Uh, Later on, while I was writing the book, I found out about a group of Army that I'd never heard of either, called the ASA, the Army Security Agency. And they were starting to set up listening posts as well with sound detection equipment. I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah.
But anyway, when we got to Vietnam, they canceled that idea. They decided they did not want to do that. Maybe because the ASA was working for them, I don't know. But that left me without a job, and that's how this all came to be.
So, but that didn't happen until you were actually in Vietnam.
Pardon me?
That change didn't happen until you were actually in Vietnam.
Yes. Yeah,
And,
I was already there.
and so you're there, and now they have to decide what you're going to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, how would you describe the work you did in Vietnam in 1961, 1962?
Actually, I wasn't in Vietnam until 1962.
Okay, so you got there in 62. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Right at the end of January, 1st of February, somewhere in there.
Oh, so very early 62.
Yeah, very early. Yeah.
So you're there in early 62, the things change. Now we need to decide what to do with you. And so what do you end up doing in Vietnam?
I was paired with a gentleman after being interviewed at there's an old French hangar there at Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, and it had a bunch of offices and things in the back. I was taken back there and interviewed for about 2 hours with this guy, and he had all my military records, personal records, and everything scattered out on his desk there. And he talked to me for a long time. He paired me with this gentleman who was in the room at the time, who was in civilian clothes as well, and told me that they had a job for me, but you've got to volunteer for
Hmm.
it. And I said, well, I'm here, and I never thought about it, In fact, I still didn't know what was going on in Vietnam at that point. I just got there,
Wow.
and
Yeah.
so I just figured it'd be some kind of job, and so okay, I'll do it. And little did I know,
Wow. What was the job?
his personal assistant.
Okay. And his personal assistant doing what?
Well, as it turned out, we did a lot of covert stuff. Uh, we did. This is what's difficult to talk about. We did some assassinations of uh, President No Dien Dien's cabinet, not cabinet members, but people in the government that had been found to have communist leanings and were had connections in North Vietnam. Were doing various things, and we never knew for sure if it was sanctioned by the government of Vietnam or if it was just something that the CIA felt needed to be done. And it took me a long time, even years later, to realize that I was literally working for the CIA and didn't know it. I didn't know what the gentleman I was talking about. His name is Silver, and I didn't really think about it much years later that he was actually a CIA field officer. And
So just to make sure I have what you just said, that you were involved in, you arrive in early 62, you go there as a radar guy, but that changes. They're not going to need that. And so now you're involved in covert operations, and these covert operations involve, among other things, assassinating people within the government of South Vietnam who have been identified as pro-communist or perhaps in cahoots with the North. Is that right?
that was my understanding what we were doing.
Yeah. And if any of these questions I ask, if you don't like the questions, just feel free to let me know. But this did, on your part, involve being involved in taking those people out.
Yes.
Wow. You say in your book that you refer to No Dinh Diem. A little quote is that he seems like a tyrant. Was this something, when you first realized that this is what you're going to be involved in, that you're doing these things either directly for the CIA or the government of South Vietnam, but the CIA is involved, but you're involved in taking out these people within the government of South Vietnam. I mean, what was I'm just curious, and I understand it was many decades ago, but how did you initially process this? I mean, you don't go into the Air Force to do that kind of work, right? And
No.
when you're trained on radar, you're not anticipating doing this kind of work. I'll just use that word work. I mean, what was your own sort of mental, psychological process of not only realizing this is what I'm going to be involved in, but now the job is done, and saying, well, that's something that I have done. I was involved in it. What was your sort of psychological process at the time of, to the extent possible, making sense of what you were involved in?
I can remember that I was pretty upset by it. That is something I'd never dreamed of. You go in the military, there's always a chance of war. And in war, there's always a chance of, having to fight or be killed or kill others. That's just part of life. History, teaches you it's always been done. But this was kind of different, and
Yeah.
I remember just getting sick at my stomach several times, just getting very ill, very disturbed about it. lot of time laying for long periods of time and just, you know, not confused. I think a young person at that age, they handle it better than we would at our age now. But it was still just very hard on me to do it, and it only got worse as time went on. And
You mean as you come back to the States and get back into civilian life, and then you get to retirement and you're able to reflect back? Is that what you mean by it becomes harder as time goes on?
yes, yeah.
At the time, you know, we have to rationalize. I mean, not many people can just do that and then not think about it. And clearly, you know, you did think about it. So we need to come up with, you know, stories to tell ourselves about, you know, what I'm doing. At the time, was your thought process, you know, this is one of the tough things about the fight against communism? Is that how you kind of thought about it in your mind, that this is the part I'm playing in the struggle against communism? Or these were the orders?
I don't think so. I don't think that really ever crossed my mind about the communism thing. You know, since this all took place, since I wrote the book, I have read so much. I've studied the Vietnam War from all the way back from Street Without Joy by Bernard Fall and Sir Max Hastings, Vietnam, the Epic Tragedy. You know, I've read every book that I can get my hands on. And I realized that why we were there, according to the politics of the time. I'm aware of that, but I don't think that was in my mind at that time. I was in a strange place that I never dreamed even existed. At least the guys that went there in the later '60s, they hadn't seen pictures. They knew what they were going to do. I had no idea when I went, and that was a shock to everything in me, just to know that a place like that exists. And no, I think I was just more concerned with doing what I was told, and later on trying to stay alive.
Wow. So as I mentioned a minute ago, you know, toward the end of your book, you say that Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam before the coup in 1963, and you were, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, how early you were there. You did your service in Vietnam before the coup against Diem. I mean, you say that you left Da Nang in '62, and it's not 3 years. I mean, it's 3 years still to go before the Marines actually even get in there in any significant numbers. I mean, it's really kind of amazing how early you were there. But you say that Ngo Dinh Diem seems like a tyrant. Is that something that was clear to you then? Is it something that only became clear to you looking back? I mean, at the time when you were there, did you feel like, you know, this government of South Vietnam is not a pretty picture?
Well, no, not so much. The thing that got me with Jim is I saw him twice, and one time was I even related it in my book about the street scene there on Tudo Street, where he was in his big limousine with the top down and his fancy white suit, you know, and this old man, an old street peddler, too slow to move, you know, and with his heavy cart trying to get out of the way, and he's stopping that, and his henchman up there just pushing the old man, knocking his cart over, knocked him down, and just, you know, and so they could go on their merry way, and that just infuriated. It just, you know, I thought if somebody that rotten, you know, and we're over here trying to defend him, you know, that did not sit well at the moment. My partner just kind of had to say, "Hey, come on, let's get out of here," you know, and get away. So we just went down another street and got away from there. He knew I was really mad about it, and
Wow.
and yeah, that's basically it. I don't think the man was. And in reading later on in years about him, he was a pretty sorry individual in my estimation.
Well, you know, I don't. my own view, and I'm interested in hearing your responses, when you think about the disaster of the Vietnam War, the tragedy of it, there's a lot of blame to go around.
Mm.
But more than any other single person, I'm not saying it's all Jim's fault, but I'm saying more than any other single person, I would lay the tragedy at the feet of No Dinh Diem. Again, there's plenty of blame to go around. We can talk about Kennedy, we can talk about LBJ, we can talk about Nixon, we can talk about the general whose name, Westmoreland. There's a lot we could talk about. We talk about the French. My own view is more than any other single person, though, No Dinh Diem bears responsibility, just because I mean, what you described, he made no real attempt to win the loyalty of the people to that government. Do you agree with that assessment, or what's your thought about that?
Well, like you say, there's a lot of blame to go around, but he never had the hearts. He was Catholic, and
Not a very good one. I mean,
not a very good one. No, but he and I didn't know this at the time, of course, but he had a very low opinion of the Buddhist, and I didn't know what politics was. I didn't have time to even study the politics. I couldn't read the newspapers. I went to a couple of movies, but you couldn't understand the newsreels either, because they were all in either Vietnamese or French. So I was really like standing outside a window with no sound effects, and just trying to observe what I was seeing. And I could see that people were, my partner had been there for years and years and years. I don't know how long, probably mid 50s, I'm guessing, or late 50s anyway.
wow.
And he said that in the time he had been there, that Saigon had probably doubled in population.
Hmm.
And it was because the people were in deep trouble, and the buildings down in Saigon were close together, sometimes about 4 to 6 feet apart, and the people would go in and they would make shelters between these buildings, and that was probably all well and good, in the dry season. But during the rainy season, the conditions some of them lived in, with whole families living in space 4 feet wide by maybe 8 feet deep, was pathetic.
Yeah.
And I think he was destroying the country. I think he was destroying a beautiful city in doing that.
Mm.
And that was just my assessment. And then seeing the city and everything, I'd never been in a city like that where life was in your hands. I didn't know at the time though, that we had a $5,000 reward on our heads.
On your heads?
Yeah,
By
almost
the
anybody in
North
the
Vietnamese?
country.
The North Vietnamese had put a price on your head?
I don't know who was offering it, but that's what I was told later on, that we had a bounty on our head. Any American military was there.
Now you initially went to Vietnam in early '62 to do training with ARVN forces, with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Did you and now you end up not doing the radar work, you're doing this other covert work. Did you do operations with ARVN forces, with South
No,
forces?
we did not. Silver and I, well, I'll take that back. We did have a couple of instances where we acted with some ARVN forces somewhere up south of Da Nang. Somewhere we went out a couple times, and then there was a time that we had interrupted an ambush where the Vietcong were fixing to ambush the ARVN unit. And but as far as going out in the field working with them, we did not as advisors.
Okay.
We yeah.
Well, the reason I ask that is because I'm still kind of on this theme of Diem and the society there, that we are there to, the goal is to help this society get on its feet, to stand against the North, and to be an independent country. So this would be the rationale for getting rid of North Vietnamese moles in the government or pro-communist elements within the government. So that would be the rationale. Um, so I'm curious, in the interactions you had with the ARV, and it sounds like it wasn't extensive, but the interactions you had with them, did you pick up from them that they were confident, that they were committed to the success of their own country? Did you walk away from those experiences feeling like, this is a military that has potential?
No, I don't think I experienced enough with them to make a judgment. I go back to a lot of friends who were there in later years, said they were okay, but at the time I wasn't real confident in them. They seemed to lack leadership.
I want to ask about Saigon. You mentioned Saigon. You just said a little bit about Saigon. You're in Vietnam so early in the American experience. What was Saigon like at that time? When we think of Saigon during the Vietnam War, we think of the black market. We think of the clubs and the GIs and all this stuff. What was Saigon like in '62? Did it still have very much of a French flavor to it? Did you hear French spoken in the streets? What was Saigon like in '62?
I thought it was beautiful. I truly did.
Yeah.
I stayed at the Continental Hotel on Trudeau Street for about 10 days when I first got there. There was a movie theater down the street that I went to by myself. I didn't realize later on that I probably shouldn't have, but I did. And there was streets. There was shops along there that were really interesting to go into. I actually bought my wife an adai, women's dress. I bought her one of those and had it made to her fittings, and sent it home to her.
Wow.
I thought it was just a beautiful city, and the people were friendly at the time. I ate a lot of times. I ate in the market. I'd go down to the market in the morning and eat my breakfast in the market. And
Yeah.
I'm glad I got to see that, because I read what it became too, and I don't know that I wouldn't have been there then. I really don't.
And were you in civilian clothes a lot of the time? That's one of the things you say in your book, that you're in civilian clothes. Was that actually the case for you?
From the day I took the job, the first thing they did was took me and had me changed back into civilian clothes, and I was in civilian clothes until the day I got on the plane to leave the next.
Wow. So you're in civilian clothes the whole time.
And no dog tags, no ID cards, nothing.
So when people asked you, which I'm sure they did, who are you and what are you doing here? What were you supposed to say? What was the line you had to tell people who you were and what you were doing in Vietnam?
Just avoided it mostly. Depended on the situation. Did a lot of lying. It wasn't a really outstanding thing because of a lot of people that were in civilian clothes.
Okay, there were a lot of non-Vietnamese in Saigon at the time, so maybe you didn't stand out so much.
Yeah. And even in the field, there was a lot of people in civilian clothes.
One of the things that comes up in your book is time you spend, is it a Montagnard village, I think?
Yes, and that was the high point of the whole thing, living in that village in the Central Highlands.
That was in the Central Highlands. What were you doing in this Montagnard village?
We went up there and we trained 25 young men as soldiers, armed them, and our job was to go over. We were right out on the corner of where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia come together, and we were doing reconnaissance work on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the CIA had found out that there was stuff being moved down the trail. So
Mm.
we went over there to do that. Of course, Silver had been in the villages before. He spoke the languages. He was obviously the one to spearhead something like that. I was just there to do what he told me.
So you were doing reconnaissance, gathering information about what was happening on the Ho Chi Minh Trail,
Yeah,
which of course,
and a bit of harassment.
and a bit of arrest as well, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I mean, again, that's amazing because of course the Ho Chi Minh Trail becomes a major theme of the war. You're there so early doing reconnaissance. So you're doing that work. Why do you say that, and you're training these Montagnards, and unlike the Arvin, where, generally speaking, veterans don't have a whole lot of good to say, not about Arvin soldiers as individuals, but just the culture they were part of, and anyway, but different from that, veterans who worked with the Montagnards, I think almost uniformly speak of them very highly as,
Oh yeah,
highly dedicated and highly skilled. Do you agree with that?
and highly intelligent and loyal.
Yeah.
They're just super people. I I had an experience this year. A friend of mine who is a photojournalist and had come back from, he was in Vietnam in 2018. Come home. He's married to a Montagnard girl,
Oh wow.
and my wife and I went out over New Year's and visited with them for a couple of days. And she's the first Montagnard person I've seen in 60 years.
Wow.
And first of all, she's beautiful, and second of all, she's the best cook you could ever imagine.
Mm.
And it was just a real pleasure to be there and talk to her, and of course, hear some of the stories that they experienced when they were in Vietnam, before they came home. Yes, I loved them. I just did, and from almost the day we come into the village, we were just family. We ate what they ate. We lived in a hut like they did. We hunted with them. We just lived in that village for, like, from there till right around the 1st of April sometime.
Wow.
And
What motivated them? I mean, I imagine they're not, I don't know this, but I'm imagining they're not sitting around talking about the problems of communism versus the free market and things.
mm,
I mean, what's motivating the Montagnards to be involved in this?
well, they hated the Vietnamese for one thing, uh, and they didn't particularly distinguish between North and South Vietnamese.
Mm.
But uh, the NVA and BC started putting pressure on them, and they didn't handle that real well. Now, I understand later on in the 60s that some of the Montagnards did actually side with the BC. I don't know why. There's about 50 different tribes of the Montagnard. The ones that I was associated with, I'm fairly sure, although at the time I didn't know and didn't even dream that there were different tribes, but I believe they were Jariah, and the Jariah were definitely friends of ours, and the Rade were too. But they were just they had been treated like indigenous people all the world over for all those years. The modern Vietnamese are immigrants from China from about 2,000 years ago. And when they started moving down into Vietnam, the Montagnard were coastal people. And when the Chinese come down, they pushed them all back up into the Central Highlands. And although they thrived up there, they never forgot that. And they did not like the Chinese people at all.
And the Chinese over time, now we think of them as the Vietnamese. So was the problem that the NVA and the VC, when they had these problems with the Montagnards, was it that they wanted to or they actually did recruit the Montagnards or force the Montagnards to help them in their operations on the trail. And
Yeah, at least side with them. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Spy for them, whatever they can do.
So you were involved in training these Montagnards then to fight, or what sort of training were you doing with them?
Mostly, when we arrived, they were using crossbows to hunt with,
Hmm.
and we gave them weapons, arms, and we taught them. Although I'm telling you, it wasn't hard. They picked it up fast, you know. And there was a little bit of things we had to teach them how to carry the weapon, how to ready the weapons, how to clean the weapons, how to keep them in order, but as far as being soldiers, I think they didn't require much training there. They were soldiers themselves.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
and yeah.
Did that village, when you were there, did it have any problems with the Viet Cong?
Not in the village. We didn't. We never saw any in the village. The friend I was telling you about, we went to see over. Him and his wife, of course, they understand the culture and everything. And he told me this weekend that after my description of the village to him, that he believes it was not a permanent village. He believes it was a satellite village for some purpose of theirs. I don't know what, and he didn't either. But he said it was not unusual for them to establish a satellite village for maybe hunting or maybe some other purpose they had. Because after he told me that, I don't remember ever seeing a graveyard there. And they were very big into their graveyards, burying their families, there. And
Right.
and there was no longhouse in the village, and that's something you usually see in a Montagnard village, is a longhouse. And at that time, it was meaningless to me at the time, but later on, I just learned that. So I don't know why they were up there. It was a nice place. The village was. It was kind of sitting on top of a little hill, not much of a hill, kind of like the side of a hill,
Yeah.
and it was had a small, bigger than a creek, smaller than a river, stream down maybe 100 yards below the village where they got their water from and everything. And it was a pleasant place. Didn't have as many insects as I'd seen in other places in Vietnam.
You
And
mean in terms of mosquitoes, leeches, that sort of thing?
yeah.
Wow.
It was
Wow.
much healthier type environment, which was welcome.
Yeah. So far as you know, these Montagnards then that you helped train, did they face any reprisals that you know of from the Viet Cong for being involved in this training?
Well, as you know in the book, the village was destroyed somewhere about the end of March, and Silver and I both believed that was why, that either the Viet Cong tracked us down, and waited till we weren't there and attacked the village and pretty much destroyed it and killed a lot of people. And I've always assumed that that's probably what happened.
And do I understand correctly that one of these Montagnards who was killed was someone who was at that time pretty close to you?
Yes, she was.
Yeah. Well,
I'll never forget her. Yeah, she was just a sweet girl. She really was. And that was pretty hard to take. Probably in one sense of the word, I don't know what would happen if she hadn't, because I'd fallen pretty much head over heels in love with her, and I don't know if I'd have wanted to leave or not had it not happened.
well,
But
Are you willing to say what her name was?
I gave her the name of Sweet because after 60 years, that's about as close as I can remember to what it actually sounded like.
Hmm.
And I looked through books of Montagnard names, and that was the closest that I could come to it. Now, that realize that name is also a surname for them, but it's still as closest thing I can remember to what her name was.
Sweet.
And I buried so much of this. Preston, I buried so much of this. And when I started trying to write this, it was amazing how much of it came back to me. As I would write something, it would remind me of something else. And I have to add at that point, that's why I encourage every vet that I meet to write their stories, because it will clear your mind of things that you don't know are there. Because just writing it will bring out memories that maybe you need to get rid of, maybe you need to face. And I think in my case, that's what happened. You know.
Wow.
And as you remember in the book, I buried her in my own hands.
So I don't know the chronology of events and the chronology of, things that you were involved in when you were in Vietnam. Of course, early in the discussion, we were talking about, taking out people within the South Vietnamese government identified as pro-communist. I don't know if you did that kind of work after the village was attacked, after Sui was killed, and then you buried her. But if so, it's a hard question to ask, but you hear people who experience combat say that after a while you become so angry and so hardened that you actually want to go out and get the VC. You actually want to go out and get the NVA. Did that happen to you? As you experience these things, you see what happens to the village, you see what happens to Swedes, very personal for you. Did that same thing happen to you, that at that moment then, okay, now I want to go get someone else?
I had that feeling when it happened to her, but fortunately, most of the other stuff was right early when I got there.
Oh.
Yeah, it was quite early. The first thing we got involved in, and we did a couple of other things. We did some more covert work, and most of that was all done before we ever went up there. After we got up there, that was our primary job. And that was if the village hadn't, well, if the village hadn't got taken out, if Silver hadn't been killed, we would have been there for a long time because it was a big job. And at that time, it seemed like every 4 to 5 days there would be a small caravan coming down the trail. At that time, it was mostly the goods were carried on bicycles or water buffalo. In some cases, elephants. I think the first group we actually saw were with elephants, and it was at that time just a trail. I understand later on it got big enough they brought vehicles down, but at that time it was mostly just a trail, and it turned into a supply line that probably if it hadn't have been there would have made a big difference in how the Vietcong and how the NVA fought the war, and because they were bringing some of it down the rivers, some of it down around the coast, but a huge part of their stuff came down that trail.
Coming down that trail, yeah. And so you're there with the Montagnards in that area where the Cambodia, Laos, South Vietnam come together, focused on that. You've mentioned Silver a few times. I'm guessing that was was that a code name that your partner went by, or is that his actual last name?
That's the only name I ever knew him by. He made a statement that we weren't supposed to get acquainted that way. In the case that we were captured, and he didn't tell me that right off, or I'd have been scared out of my mind. But later on, he told me that we shouldn't know each other's names in case we were captured, and could divulge that information. And
he was Silver, and you were, is it Boots?
Boots, yeah.
You were
all because when the first time he saw me, when I changed out of my uniform, I had this pair of sort of gold-colored Nakona cowboy boots, and that was what my civilian shoes. And I'd lived in Arizona all those years. I dressed like a dressed Western, and that he got a kick out of the cowboy boots. He really did.
Wow. One of the reasons you have these code names is in case you're captured by the VC. Do I understand it correctly that you actually did come under VC control for a while?
After Silver was killed, I knew that I was in way over my head. I couldn't speak the languages. I didn't have the knowledge to be any kind of a team leader like that. I didn't know what I was doing, and I was way over my head. And so I knew that there was some kind of military post or something to the east of us, because he had mentioned it. And I think in my book I called it Doc Toe, but I'm not totally sure that Doc Toe was operational at that point. Mm. And if it wasn't anything to what it later became. But I was trying to get back. I should have probably went to Pleiku, because Pleiku would have been about the same distance, a little bit farther south. But this Montagnard young man, he told me he would take me there. And that's what we did. We headed out and walked around a tree, and there's 5 Vietcong soldiers standing there with their guns leveled at me. And there was no discussion about whether or not I was captured. They took several days. I'm not sure how many. I think I was insinuated it was 5 or 6, 7 days, but I don't know if that's true. I don't know how long it was, because they kind of dragged me along behind them. Eventually, we got to the village that they put me in a tiger cage for 2 weeks. And there was the NVA lieutenant here at that village. This had to have been somewhere up close to the North Vietnam, South Vietnam border, and Laos, somewhere there. I'm just only guessing. And he was trying to interview me, and there was not much I could actually tell him, in all honesty, because I didn't know what was troop locations and fortified villages. I didn't know any of that stuff, so he didn't get a lot out of it.
Did he find out you were U.S. military, or did you have a story? I was a civilian, and what did you tell him? I mean, what was your story?
I told him that my partner and I, who had been killed, my partner was a professor at a school back in the United States, and we were studying the Montagnard culture, and that's what we were doing there. He never believed it. He never believed it. But,
he never believed it. Was it? I think you told him you were going to UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin, something. Is that right? Or?
Yeah.
And he didn't believe that. They have you in this cage for 2 weeks. Is that it? You're just in the cage and they're talking to you, or are they trying to get information from you other ways?
Oh, they were trying to get information out of it. Seriously. I don't think I thought much about it at the time, but it never ceases to amaze me how cruel one human being can be to another, they did some pretty severe things to me. And, but like I say, I would have probably told them anything they wanted, if it would have worked, but I didn't know anything. And I wasn't about to tell them who I really was. I knew enough to not do that. I'm just a green 22-year-old kid from Northeast Arkansas, that got caught in something way over his head, That's basically what the story is.
Wow. So the one thing that you could tell him that you didn't is that you're in the Air Force. You didn't tell him that, so you held to that story. But otherwise, he would ask for military information, and you honestly didn't have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was no way I was going to associate myself with the military.
Did you assume at some point in those 2 weeks that this was it?
I tell people now when I talk about it, for the entire month of April of 1962, I considered myself a dead man. I knew I was never going to come out of that jungle. I didn't know exactly when it was going to happen, but I knew that I would never come out alive. And I did.
Was that at some point, did fear just give way to kind of a numb resignation?
Yeah. See, this is the hard part right here. I think that maybe I might have lost a bit of my mind there for a while, because there's so much of that I really don't remember. There was time passed that I don't remember. There was times I would be put back into the cage unconscious, and wake up in the middle of the night, and the whole thing is kind of I had to, when I was writing the book, I had to write something. So I wrote little bits and pieces that I could remember, but there's so much of it I don't remember. So much of it I don't want to remember. Yeah. Because they did a pretty good job on it. And, but 2 weeks in that cage, I know there was guys that lasted longer than that. I don't know how. Man, that's about as bad as it gets.
That's as bad as it gets because of, I imagine, whatever the torture you're experiencing. Is it also the heat and the humidity and the insects and just, there's no rest. At points you're unconscious, but yeah.
The thing that probably saved me was that somewhere within the last 4 or 5 days, he really made me angry. He really pissed me off, to use the proper expression. And I knew that I was going downhill fast. And I realized that if I didn't do something, that I was not going to, I wouldn't have a chance. So I started at night when everybody go to sleep. I started exercising. I would lay on my back in the cage and ride a bicycle, upside down. And I would swing my arms around and work my arms, because they worked on my arms an awful lot. They were destroying muscle. They were really messing with me in that way. And I knew if I didn't do something, that I wouldn't stand a chance. And as it turned out, that worked, and I did. I'd do push-ups. I would do anything. It was really hard to do push-ups in a 4-foot long cage too. I want you to know. Yeah. The cage was about 4 foot cube, and it wasn't room to do much, but I did what I could. And I think he was wearing out too. I think he's about to decide I was just a lost cause. And that was not in my favor because I knew that I would never get out of there. When he got through with me, he'd kill me. And they would do things like they would take me, and this is the one I still have this, probably the one that I have the most trouble getting over with is they would take me out of the cage, he'd stand there and berate me and tell me that I was just worthless and I wasn't going to do anybody any good and I was stupid and I'm just going to kill you. And they'd put a gun up to my head and just, put a gun up to my head and then they would fire another right behind me, and they did that 2 or 3 times. And that's the one I still have problems with fireworks over that. And not firework displays, but people in neighborhoods, shooting mortars, in the middle of the night, and that type of thing. That's the one thing I have to be able to get a handle on yet. I don't know if I ever will or not.
Why do you think they let you go? I mean, why didn't when
they didn't let me go?
Oh, so
I escaped. Yeah, one day they threw me back in the cage. I kind of reached back, pulled myself up, and I cut my hand on something. And so as soon as they left, I reached down and dug it out. It was a can lid, like Spam or some kind of a food can. And I looked at it for a few minutes. I cut a pretty good slice inside of my hand. And I got to thinking. And so I started, when nobody was looking, I would sharpen it on the sand. And I sharpened it. And I picked the back end of my cage where it's kind of back in toward a little tree there, a bush. And I would, of a night, I would saw on those, the cage was made out of bamboo. And they used strips of green bamboo for bindings around the, where they put it together. Yeah. And I started working those bindings with that. And it took me 3 nights to cut through one binding to where I could get one slat loose. And I picked a night that was, there'd been a bunch of troops come through the village. And they all pretty well left. There wasn't much of anybody that I'd seen there except some women and kids and some old men and maybe 1 or 2 soldiers and the lieutenant himself. And so I waited till about 2 o'clock in the morning, or as I could tell, when the moon kind of set a little bit and it was dark. I cut the rest of that binding and I kicked the piece out and I crawled out and that's how I got out.
Wow. Where did you go?
I knew that my only prayer, not knowing where I was to go to the coast, which was, I didn't know how far that was either, but I knew that on the coast I would be able to find military units, Arban or somebody, And so I headed east.
East.
Yeah. And sometimes I would go south and sometimes I would go east. And I was barefoot.
Yeah.
And my feet was just in tatters. And the everything else was too. Food, I was half starved. And I lost 40-something pounds there in about a month. And but that's what I started. I realized that I couldn't travel in the daytime. I would stick out like a sore thumb. Here I am, 6-foot guy, in the country that people are, 5'4",
Yeah.
And so I would get up in a tree and and tie myself into a tree at night, sleep, or in the daytime,
in the day.
and then I would come down and travel at night.
Wow.
And it took a long time, but I made it to the coast. And the morning I got there, I hadn't no sooner got out there, like an RVAN unit came up the road. I hailed them. They started shooting at me, and I dived behind a tree or something. I don't remember what it was now. And I started hollering, "American soldier, American soldier." And finally, ever been into somebody. There was a Jeep and a truck, and like a 6x or something. And they finally somebody yelled, "American soldier." I said, "Yes." And he says, "Come out." And I said, "Well, don't shoot." And so I come out. And, I went down. They gave me some water, gave me some food, and tried to ask me. He didn't speak very good English either. And he asked me where I was from. Of course, I couldn't tell him. And but that time I had stopped, and that's why they almost shot me. I had stopped in a village while the people was out during the day or somewhere late in the evening, and I picked up a set of pajamas for, like, the Vietnamese peasant dress, and was because my other clothes were just off of me, and I was wearing those, and that's why they almost shot me. But they put me in the Jeep and started back south with me, and think I passed out because I don't remember the trip. I don't know how far it was. I don't imagine it's probably 35, 40 miles north of Da Nang somewhere. And I don't have no idea. But when I kind of came to myself, we was rolling in the gates there at Da Nang, and the air police there just wanted, "Who are you? Where you from?" All this stuff. I couldn't talk to them. They took me to the infirmary, and I think I passed back out pretty much as soon as I got there. I woke up the next morning, and there's this beautiful nurse, looking at me, and they fed me, man. That was the best food in the world.
Wow. How long did it take for them to figure out who you were? Or did you tell them, did you give them all the info, or were you still going by boots?
I just kept telling them to call Dan in the embassy down in Saigon. I said, "Call Dan. He'll vouch for me." And evidently, he got word or something anyway. So I think they told me I could go down to Saigon to the embassy. Seemed to be the way it started. So I hopped a flight and flew down there, and I went to the embassy, and Dan wanted to know where Silver was, and that's when I had to tell him that he'd been killed, and he said that the Air America plane that scouted the village for us all the time and saw that the village was destroyed, burned, and that he wouldn't risk a landing, and see if we were there. And there wasn't very many people there, and I guess he circled it a few times, and he reported that we weren't there. But that had been 2 or 3 weeks before, and he didn't know what would happen to us. And so he just told me, that I don't remember what he told me. I don't remember. But I went back over. He told me I could have a room there at the Continental, so I went and got another room at the Continental. And I sat there that one night. I just I went back up to Da Nang, and there was a reason for that. But to be honest with you, I don't know why I went back up there.
Hmm.
But I know that for some reason I went back to Da Nang, and then I got in trouble with this lieutenant who still thought I was a deserter or something, and threw me in the stockade there at Da Nang. And one of the APs, I told him if he would to see if he could get message back down to Dan. And evidently it took a few days. And then Dan shows up, and he takes me out of the stockade, gives me a uniform, says you're getting on a plane. And I got on a plane late in the afternoon and flew to the Philippines. I was debriefed in the Philippines and flew back to Travis and was given separation from active duty. And my dad had got injured in northern Arkansas up there. The guy had hit him in the head with a crescent wrench and hurt him pretty badly. And the Red Cross had been looking for me for about 2 weeks. And that's when Dan had found that out after I'd left down there and went up. So he was looking for me again because he didn't know what happened to me either.
Wow.
And then when at AP got the message down there, he brought everything up, and I came home. I'll never forget that, they just told me that thing there in the Philippines, they just told me to go back and resume my civilian life. And they didn't give me a handbook to do that.
It's unbelievable. And one of the things you mentioned in the book is you're watching the news. And here again, we're talking 62. It's really early in the Vietnam story. You're watching the news. There's nothing about Vietnam. How would you describe that? I mean, you're coming home from Southeast Asia. You've experienced everything that you've discussed. Not just being in Vietnam, not just seeing the world of war as it was, as you experienced it, but as a person dressed in civilian clothes, covert operations, this 2-week being held by the Vietcong for 2 weeks. Then you've got this officer who thinks you're a deserter, you're in the stockade, you go through all of this in a really short period of time. And then now you're back in civilian life in the States. And the overwhelming majority of people aren't even aware that at that time, they're really not even aware anything is going on in Vietnam. How, to the extent possible that you can describe what that was like for you, what was that like for you?
It was as hard an adjustment as it was going to Vietnam in the first place. Because I go back home and I land at Little Rock, and my mom and my sister come down and pick me up. And no, I guess my dad was there too. He was out of the hospital. My dad came too. Yeah. And I go back, and I think the next day I didn't do much, and then the next day I found myself on a little John Deere tractor out there working on the field, going around this field in circles, and I kept just looking around me, and it just seemed surreal. It seemed totally surreal. And I hated being there.
You mean back home?
Yeah. I just hated being there. And I it started a new life for me that wasn't really good for me. I told my wife here that when I told her all these stories that I lived there for years. I lived two separate lives. I lived a life with my family and I lived a life outside it. And I did crazy stuff. I just did crazy stuff, you know, that ordinary people wouldn't think of doing.
Was the
And
doing crazy stuff, and I don't know if you're willing to tell us, you know, what some of that stuff was, but was doing this crazy stuff, you sometimes hear people who come back from the world of war and they'll say, you know, there was a kind of intensity over there and there was a kind of simplicity over there that, as horrible as it was, you kind of miss it too. You miss the adrenaline. Was that kind of what it was for you?
yeah, 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 going from life and death to nothing, you know, driving a little John Deere tractor down the field. Yeah, it was. I did all kinds of things. I would stalk people. I stole stuff, not
Was,
because I needed it, but you know,
for the thrill.
yeah, because I
Was
could.
that was that as you say you stalk people? Would you link that to the work you did early in your time in Vietnam?
Oh yeah, sure it was. It just I don't have any other explanation for it. You know, I really don't, because people in their right minds don't do stuff like that. You know, and it you know it's you can you can interview my wife. She'll tell you some of these things. I don't like going in a restaurant setting unless I can sit with my back to the wall. I don't like going any place where I'm not secure. I'm claustrophobic. I've got uh, issues with when I drive. I'm always looking for a way out. I'm always looking for uh, uh, an escape, so to speak. Um, it's I suppose it's a type of paranoia, but I don't consider it such. I just consider it something that I have to do.
Mm.
Um, I I get even now. I get terribly angry at fireworks, like I was talking about. Not the big displays, but the individual. I hate them. I get very angry about it. And of course, at the age I am now, I have to watch my blood pressure. And but
Did it take you a while to realize that these things, you know, wanting to, it's something I've heard a lot, you know, if I'm in a restaurant, I want my back to the wall and I want to be able to see as many people as I can, keep my eye on that, just as an example. Did it take a while for you to realize that all of these things, that they were linked to your year in Vietnam? Or, you know, because often vets will say, you know, I came home from the war and felt a certain way, but it just seemed like, you know, as hard as it was, it seemed normal. I didn't really connect it to Vietnam. Often what I'll hear is they'll say it wasn't really until decades later that I realized that the anger or this tendency I had in crowds or something, it wasn't until decades later that I realized that it was linked to that time in Vietnam. Is that for you? Same true for you?
yeah, it was subconscious. It was subconscious. It took years before I realized, you know, the reasoning behind it. And I still do it. I mean, even though I know the reasoning,
You know,
I still would rather, I'd rather be secure in my environment. I think it's the proper expression for it.
you know, one of the things I noticed is um you've told some, I mean, some, you know, amazing stories and some hard stories. Um, the one place, though, where, at least from my, you know, from what I could see, that you seem to be moved the most was when you talked about just seeing that nurse. when you were back in Da Nang, after you escaped. You say that you're wearing Vietnamese clothing. I'm guessing, they might, you're thin enough at this because you lost so much weight. You're thin enough that they fit, but I imagine, that must have come down to like halfway down your arm or something. What for them would be a full sleeve is halfway down your arm and, probably barely covering your shins. So that must have been a spectacle all by itself, seeing you in these Vietnamese clothes. But you see that nurse. As you look back on that now, what is it about that particular thing that, as you related that story, was so moving to you? And you didn't really say anything that the nurse did. You just said you saw the nurse.
I think I realized at that moment that I was safe again.
Mm.
I knew that I was conscious, I was awake, and there was a white woman standing there looking at me, in a nurse's uniform. I think that's probably what it was.
And just sort of the realization that if this is right, sometimes I hear from Vietnam vets, the guys out in the field especially, and you're out in the field, but in a very distinct way, that after a while you know that there's a world outside of this that exists, but you kind of forget because the jungle of Vietnam becomes everything. Was that partly it, just a reminder that, oh yeah, there really is a world out there beyond this that I'm going to get to go back to eventually?
There was times when I would think about. I even mentioned it in my book. I would be somewhere and wonder what the people my age were doing back in the state. They were, hanging out at the service station, on the Saturday evening, and talking about cars, music, and drinking malted milks, and eating cheeseburgers, and it seemed such a foreign thing to think of at the time.
Mm.
But I think all guys do that when they're off, and serving, and I think that's a natural thing to think about. But it becomes a foreign country to you. It's your country, it's your home, but it becomes kind of a foreign place to you. At least in my mind, it did.
Kind of is this how it works when you're in Vietnam? In your mind, home becomes this idealized, almost heavenly paradise, but then you actually get back and home is driving a tractor in circles. And as awful as Vietnam was, it certainly was a heck of a lot more exciting than this.
I got to tell you about an experience that within, I'd say probably a month or so after I got back, we started going back to a little Methodist church that, I'd grown up in, during high school and everything,
Yeah.
and went to, and all the younger boys, that were just little kids when I'd left home. And so my Silver and I had sat and talked many times about how this was going to evolve. It was going to get worse, much worse. Mm-hmm. He, with all of his experiences, he knew, and we talked about it. So I started talking to the young guys, that were coming on 17, 18-year-old, went to church there, and telling them, you need to prepare yourself. There's going to be a war. It's coming. It's not going to be long, maybe 2 years or 3 years, but it's coming. And the elders in the church heard about it, and they just gave me holy hell and told me I couldn't do this, that I couldn't talk to these kids like this, that I was disrupting things. I couldn't come to church there if this is what I was going to do. And
because you were basically just telling the young men to get ready because something's brewing in Vietnam, and you're likely going to get involved.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And that hurt.
Why were the elders upset? They felt like you were making stuff up, or?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
that gets to a question I wanted to ask. Again, it's, I mean, incredible how early you were there, because DM, by the when you come home, DM still has a year in power. He's not
yeah,
overthrown until 63.
yeah,
Got Tonkin Gulf Resolution, 64. The Marines go into Da Nang, 65. And then in most people's mind, that's when the Vietnam War really gets started.
yes, that's right.
Are you paying attention to all this stuff? And are you playing are you paying
No,
attention? And you're
no,
not. So when
no,
Tonkin Gulf happens, it just passes you by. When the Marines go into
yeah,
Da Nang, it just passes you by.
yeah. I'm working a farm trying to make it total. My dad fortunately recovered pretty good within a year, and he got back into where he could work and everything. But I'm basically just, I've got a young son, uh, I, I'm just being a father, and a husband, and a worker, and 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 pretty screwed up in the head with my wife. She didn't like me after I come back at all. We lasted 18 years more, but we shouldn't have. It wasn't good for either one of us. And
Hmm.
yeah, and no, it wasn't a good. It wasn't. And and after the war started, I tried to watch a little bit of it, but I couldn't watch it. I just couldn't watch it. It to me, it one other experience I related in the book. I don't remember reading it, or if you remember reading it or not. And last night I was down there at the Continental Hotel. I was sitting in the sidewalk cafe outside the hotel there. A group of men, make a long story short, came in and sat down there. Two of them I recognized from the embassy as being CIA people, and three of them, by listening, I found out were business reps from the United States, and big business reps. And they sat there and drank for an hour or so, and the longer they drank, the louder they got. And the basic topic of it was is what they could do to further the war effort there and make more money, and to promote their businesses there. And that just didn't go well. I just got ill. I got, what is my country doing? To do something like this, or don't these people, does the country know about it? Is it something they're promoting? Is it, you know, and that was hard. That was really hard. That's why I went back to Da Nang, actually, I think. But I just had to get out there.
Just to get away from them,
Yeah.
to get away from Saigon. Do you happen to remember what business they were involved in?
One of them was a steel company, and one of them was a rubber company. And I've always thought the other one was a chemical company, but I'm not sure.
So different aspects of involvement in the military, in the industrial military complex.
Yeah.
Industrial.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically. Yeah.
Just a couple more questions. You mentioned the CIA. You said early in the discussion that you may have actually been working more for the CIA than for the Air Force. Just how would you describe your sense, just given your own personal experience, of CIA involvement in South Vietnam in 1962?
Oh, they ran it. The government wasn't handed over to. I'm sorry, the what do you call it?
The military.
It wasn't handed over to the military until I think it was 64. It was all run to the CIA.
Last question, and then after you respond, if there's anything else you'd like to say, I'd love to hear it. Sometimes I'll ask veterans, when were you in Vietnam? Mm-hmm. And sometimes they'll respond last night, meaning it was in my dreams, right? How does your year in Vietnam, or your time in Vietnam, how long were you in Vietnam altogether?
4.5 months, maybe. Yeah, something like that.
Okay. So your 4.5 months in Vietnam, in 1962. So we're talking about, you know, a long, long time back, 60 years, you know,
Mm.
if I have the math right. How do those 4.5 months still live with you now? How is your 4.5 months in Vietnam still a presence in your daily life now, if at all?
There's never a day goes by that I don't remember or remember something that happened or something remind me of it. I can still feel the heat on my back as I walk down trails. I can still smell the smells of the jungle. I can still see it. I don't think it. I think it's permanent there in my mind. I think it's totally permanent. And I've got lots of friends, you know, who were later years in service there, and they say a lot the same thing with them. I think it just your brain's a funny thing, you know. It's like a big old computer that you program, and I think that trauma uh, really programs it well. And I don't think you'll ever totally get rid of it. And that's what a lot of guys try to do too, to fight their PTSD. They try to forget it. But that's wrong. You should not ever do that. The only way you can ever reprogram that brain is to face it and to get it in the open and um, just come to terms with it, you know. But burying it doesn't do anything except make you sicker inside. And 18 years before I got any help from it, 18 years I had to deal with that, and just crazy man walking around, you know. And
And you went.
me and my first, huh?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Me and my first wife split up in December of 1980, and she ordered me out of the house by New Year's Eve of 1980, and I went and everything, and I went to counseling, and I just by some stroke of luck I got a Vietnam vet who was a retired major,
Mm.
and it took him about an hour to see through, and he got me started, you know, and I'd never talked to anybody about Vietnam that whole time. My wife knew I was in Vietnam, but she had no idea what was going on. And I never ever told her. I never told my parents. I never told anybody. The first person in my family that I told was after I wrote the book, my oldest son, who was just a baby then.
Wow.
And he's the first one in my family I ever told. And because I just couldn't. I you know I didn't know how to tell them. And
Wow.
and I didn't start writing until I was 74 years old. Yeah, and this education that I have gotten, and this network of people that I've met in the course of this, other writers, other historians, genealogists, veterans, you know, has been the greatest blessing that I could have ever expected in my, as they call it, golden years. I don't like that expression, but you know, yeah. Yes. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and I hope other vets will take what you say to heart and will share. When I started interviewing war veterans, it was World War II. And I watched that process of it becoming harder and harder and harder to find World War II veterans. And I mean, there just aren't many around now. And we've still got some time with the Vietnam vets, but you know, but Father Time never stops doing his work. And so it's important to get these stories down. So thank you for writing the book. Thank you for taking this time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful for the opportunity to tell this.